Summer arrived on time and nobody noticed. The hour when this story works best is the hour when nothing is asking for your attention, when the room is quiet enough that even your thoughts sound a little embarrassed for being loud. This is when history behaves most honestly. Not as spectacle, not as drama, just as something that continues whether or not anyone is impressed. Tonight we are not visiting a battlefield, or a throne, or a moment that demanded applause. We are standing at the edge of a northern forest settlement around the year 830 and watching summer arrive without ceremony. No announcement, no relief, no celebration. The season shows up exactly as scheduled and finds that nobody has been waiting for it. That is not a failure of imagination. That is simply how life worked here. The settlement sits where the forest thickens rather than clears. Trees are not scenery, they are structure. They decide where paths exist and where they do not. Houses do not face outward toward views because views are not useful. They face inward toward habit. By the time summer arrives, the forest has already claimed most sounds. Voices do not travel far. Metal does not ring clearly. Even footsteps seem to apologize for existing. The air is damp, but not refreshing. Light stretches longer each day, but does not feel generous. It simply stays, lingering without offering much in return. Summer is technically the brightest season, but brightness does not equal abundance here. It equals visibility, and visibility only reminds people how much work remains. The forest grows faster than anyone would like. Green appears everywhere it can fit. It creeps toward doors and storage and tools left unattended. Summer does not make life easier. It makes neglect more obvious. A forgotten task does not disappear in sunlight. It stands there quietly, insisting that it was always meant to be done. The people living here do not mark the season as a turning point. There is no sense that something important has begun. Summer does not arrive carrying permission to rest. It does not arrive with novelty. It arrives like a co-worker who shows up on time every day and never improves morale. The work continues at the same pace. Tools are picked up not because the season encourages it, but because they were already meant to be picked up. If anything, summer removes excuses. Cold is no longer available as an explanation. Darkness can no longer be blamed. What remains is routine exposed under longer light. The air smells heavier now, not unpleasant, just persistent. Resin and damp wood and old smoke linger without moving on. Sound behaves differently in summer, but not better. The forest absorbs it. Conversations remain close range. Nothing echoes far enough to become public. This keeps life small, not in scale, but in tone. Everything important happens within a few steps. Everything unimportant is allowed to fade before it finishes forming. No one adjusts their sleep to honor the longer days. Bodies remain loyal to exhaustion rather than sunlight. When work ends, sleep begins. When sleep begins, it does not care what the sky is doing. The sun may still be visible, but it has no authority here. It is present, but not persuasive. The day does not feel extended. It feels diluted, spread thinner across more hours, without gaining substance. There is a mild irony in how punctual summer is. It arrives right on time every year, without fail, and still manages to disappoint no one because no one expected anything. Anticipation requires spare energy. This settlement does not have much of that. There is no seasonal optimism, no talk of what this summer might bring. Summer is treated like a condition rather than an opportunity. It exists. Adjustments are made, then life continues. Children notice the change more than adults, but only because they are outside longer, not freer, just longer. Their routines stretch rather than transform. Older residents change nothing at all. Their days were already shaped by memory rather than daylight. Summer does not offer renewal. It offers confirmation. This is still the place. These are still the tasks. Nothing has shifted enough to require comment. Even the forest seems indifferent to the arrival of summer. Growth happens but without drama. Leaves do not celebrate their own return. They appear quietly and fill space efficiently. Insects become more present but not more welcome. They are tolerated the way everything else is tolerated, with patience that contains no affection. If someone were to leave this settlement during summer, they would not describe it as lively. They would describe it as visible. Life does not speed up. It simply reveals itself for longer periods. The same gestures repeated. The same work resumed. The same silences extended. Summer does not wake the settlement. It finds it already awake and slightly tired. This is the part history rarely lingers on. Seasons without transformation, time without narrative payoff. But this is where most lives existed. Not at moments of change, but inside stretches of continuity that never demanded to be remembered. Summer here does not create stories. It allows existing ones to continue without interruption. As the light stretches late into the evening, the settlement grows quieter rather than louder. There is no incentive to fill the hours just because they are available. Rest arrives when it arrives. Not earlier, not later. Summer offers time, but not desire. That remains unchanged. Eventually the season will leave the way it arrived, on time, quietly, without asking whether it made an impression, and no one will miss it. Not because it was unpleasant, but because it never asked to be noticed in the first place. Before you drift any deeper into this quiet rhythm and let your breathing follow it naturally, if this stillness helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these slow nights to continue unfolding without interruption. Now rest. The forest was not nature. It was infrastructure. The forest did not begin at the edge of the settlement. It did not surround it politely or frame it the way later centuries would imagine. It was already there before anything else decided to exist. Houses were placed inside it the way thoughts settle inside habits. Paths did not cut through trees with confidence. They negotiated. They curved slightly. They softened their intentions. The forest did not resist, but it did not cooperate either. It allowed movement only where movement had already proven necessary. This was not wilderness. It was not scenery. It was a working structure that happened to grow. From above, the settlement might look temporary, but on the ground it felt stubborn. Homes were built low, not for humility, but for efficiency. Height wasted effort. Width wasted warmth. The forest set the limits before anyone thought to measure them. Storage areas leaned against trees because trees were reliable. They stayed where they were put. Fences did not announce boundaries. Trunks did that quietly. Everyone knew where space ended, not because it was marked, but because it stopped being practical. There was no idea of entering the forest because that would suggest leaving something else. The forest was not a destination. It was the condition. Every task assumed it. Every movement adjusted to it. People did not say they were going to collect wood. They said they were doing what needed to be done. The distinction would have felt unnecessary. Wood was not a resource to be admired. It was a fact to be dealt with. Trees decided how far voices traveled. They decided how fast smells moved. Smoke did not rise cleanly, it tangled, it lingered. Resin hung in the air longer than expected. The scent of damp soil was not seasonal, it was constant. Summer did not clear it. Summer warmed it slightly and then left it to do the same work it always did. Anyone hoping the season would bring freshness misunderstood the arrangement. The forest did not refresh, it accumulated. Sound behaved strangely here. Not dramatically, just inconveniently. A dropped tool sounded closer than it was. A voice sounded farther than intended, and then disappeared. The forest absorbed noise without acknowledgement. It did not echo properly. It did not return what it was given. This made conversations careful. Words stayed near the mouth that released them. Nothing carried far enough to become public information. Privacy existed not because it was valued, but because the environment enforced it. This shaped behavior quietly. No announcements, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Everything important happened close to the body. If something needed to be known, it was said directly to the person who needed to know it. The forest did not encourage speeches. It encouraged proximity. Standing close was more efficient than trying to project. The settlement learned to live within this compression. Space felt intimate without feeling warm. The forest made everything smaller without making it cozy. Movement slowed because obstacles were constant. Roots interrupted paths. Branches lowered expectations. You did not walk quickly unless you had practiced the route enough times to trust it. Even then, the forest reminded you who had priority. Wood was everywhere, and it was never enough. It was walls and floors and roofs and tools and heat and repair. It was also weight. Every improvement carried a cost, measured in effort. Cutting wood required time. Shaping it required patience. Transporting it required strength. There was no romance in this. The forest did not inspire creativity. It generated obligations. There is a mild irony in how often later generations would describe forests as places of escape. Here there was nowhere to escape to. The forest did not represent freedom. It represented continuity. It was the reason things stayed the same. Houses were built the way they had always been built because the forest made innovation inefficient. New ideas cost energy. Old methods cost less. Even light behaved differently under the canopy. Sun reached the ground filtered and late. It arrived tired. It did not flood spaces. It settled in patches and then moved on. Summer increased the duration but not the intensity. Light stayed longer but never arrived fully. This kept expectations low. Nothing here was designed to shine. Everything was designed to last. The forest also decided where not to build. Clearings were rare and valued but not expanded recklessly. Removing trees created work that did not end. Roots resisted, soil shifted, new growth returned quickly and without apology. The forest did not accept absence. It filled gaps the moment they appeared. Leaving a space empty felt temporary, even if it was intentional. People adjusted by not fighting it. The settlement did not try to dominate its surroundings. It cooperated reluctantly. Structures leaned slightly. Roofs sloped low. Storage blended into the tree line. Nothing stood apart enough to challenge the environment. The forest tolerated this arrangement because it did not feel threatened. There was no sense of beauty attached to this, no admiration, no poetic reflection. The forest was not something to be appreciated. It was something to be managed minimally and respected quietly. Beauty requires distance. Here, distance was limited. Everything was too close to be aesthetic. Smells layered without clearing. Old smoke mixed with fresh wood. Earth stayed present. Dampness did not leave. Summer did not dry it out. It simply made it warmer. This produced a constant low weight in the air, not unpleasant enough to complain about, not pleasant enough to enjoy. It existed in the same category as everything else here. Acceptable. The forest shaped time as much as space. Tasks took longer because movement did. Planning assumed delays. Nothing was expected to happen quickly. This made patience less of a virtue and more of a requirement. You waited because rushing did not work. Impatience had no advantage. Even humor adjusted. It was subtle, dry, observational. The forest did not reward exaggeration. Loudness did not carry. Jokes stayed small and practical. There was no punchline big enough to cut through trunks and branches. Humor existed to release tension briefly, and then return to work. The idea that the forest might inspire reflection would have seemed strange. Reflection requires pause. Here pause felt risky. Standing still too long invited insects, moisture, discomfort. Movement continued, not out of urgency but out of practicality. The forest did not encourage contemplation. It encouraged completion. Summer did not change this. It did not soften the forest. It did not open it up. It simply made the same structure visible for longer hours. More light revealed more of the same obstacles. More work became possible, but also more noticeable. Neglect stood out under extended daylight. The forest did not care about seasons. Growth continued when it could. Stillness happened when it had to. Human schedules adjusted around this rather than the other way around. Summer was not a gift. It was a condition that allowed the forest to continue doing what it always did. If someone tried to imagine this place as peaceful, they would be mistaken. Calm existed, but it was earned. It came from acceptance rather than comfort. The forest did not soothe, it stabilized. It held everything in place long enough for life to continue without collapsing. This was the role of the forest, not backdrop, not sanctuary, not symbol. It was infrastructure that happened to breathe and grow. It demanded effort and returned reliability. It asked for nothing and gave no reassurance. It simply remained. In a settlement like this, sleep came easily, not because life was gentle, but because it was predictable. The forest guaranteed that. Tomorrow would require the same adjustments, the same movements, the same negotiations. Summer did not interrupt that agreement. It only illuminated it for a longer stretch of time. And so the forest stood quietly doing its work. Not inspiring, not threatening, not dramatic. Just present. Making sure nothing became simple enough to forget where it was built. Low houses and the comfort of unchanged habits. The houses did not try to stand out. They did not rise to meet the light or compete with the trees. They stayed low in a way that suggested acceptance rather than limitation. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was a practical one that no longer needed explanation. Height created exposure. Exposure created problems. The forest had already demonstrated that staying close to the ground was the most reliable way to continue existing without interruption. The roofs pressed downward gently, not aggressively, just enough to remind anyone inside that space was meant to be used carefully. Warmth stayed closer to the body this way. Heat did not drift upward and disappear. The structure held it in place without effort. The houses worked the way habits work. Quietly, efficiently, without demanding appreciation. Light entered only where it was allowed. Small openings let in enough to see what needed to be done and not much more. The goal was visibility, not brightness. Too much light would have created contrast. Contrast invited distraction. These homes were built for continuity, not inspiration. Sunlight was tolerated but not invited to rearrange the day. The long shape of the house served a specific rhythm. Activities aligned themselves along its length. Movement happened forward and back rather than outward. This reduced decision-making. You did not choose where to go. You followed the space that already existed. The house taught you how to move by refusing to offer alternatives. Summer did not challenge this arrangement. Longer days did not lead to wider openings. No one removed walls to invite warmth that already arrived anyway. The house was not impressed by the season. It had been built for colder conditions and saw no reason to renegotiate its priorities just because the sun lingered longer. There is a quiet irony in this. Summer arrives with abundance of light and the houses respond by remaining the same. They do not adjust. They do not adapt. They wait it out politely. The structure assumes that change is temporary and habit is permanent. Time has already proven this approach effective. Inside the house, the air felt stable, not fresh, not stale, just present. Smoke settled into the wood slowly and stayed, scents layered over years rather than days. Summer did not remove them. It warmed them slightly and left them where they were. The house held memory in its surfaces without trying to recall anything specific. Furniture did not move for the season. Storage remained where it had always been. Tools stayed close to the places they were used most often. Nothing was rearranged to take advantage of extra daylight. Extra daylight did not require celebration. It required endurance. The day simply lasted longer, while the body stayed the same. These houses encouraged repetition. You learned where your hand landed when you reached for something. You learned how many steps it took to cross from one end to the other. This knowledge settled into the body and reduced thought. That reduction was valuable. Thinking too much slowed work. Habit kept it moving. Children learned this early. They did not question the shape of the house. They adapted to it naturally. Their play fit the space without resistance. There were no grand gestures, no running for long distances. Movement folded inward. Even energy learned to stay compact. Older residents benefited most from this consistency. The house asked nothing new of them. It did not surprise them with new layouts or shifting purposes. Every object remained loyal to its place. This loyalty reduced strain. Familiarity became a form of rest. The low roof also softened sound. Voices stayed near the speaker. Nothing echoed long enough to feel important. Conversations remained practical. There was no room for performance. If you wanted to be heard, you stood closer. This reinforced the scale of interaction. Everything happened within reach. Summer evenings stretched, but the house did not. The interior grew darker while the outside remained visible. This contrast did not create tension. It created clarity. Inside was for rest. Outside was for work. When the body was done, the house accepted it without argument. The light could continue without you. There was no concept of seasonal redesign, no effort to make the home feel lighter or more open. That kind of thinking belonged to places where time was divided into moods. Here time was divided into tasks. The house supported that division faithfully. The materials themselves resisted change. Wood expanded and contracted but stayed in place. Repairs were made quietly when necessary. No upgrades, no improvements that altered function. The house was not a project. It was a solution that had already proven itself. One might expect summer to introduce a sense of comfort. Instead, it introduced exposure. More hours revealed dust and wear and the slow effects of use. The house responded by remaining solid. It did not apologize for its age. It did not pretend to be new. Habit settled into these walls, the way smoke settled into beams, gradually, permanently. This made leaving difficult, but not because of attachment, because the body had learned how to exist here with minimal effort. Anywhere else would require adjustment. Adjustment was expensive. In this way, the house became an extension of routine rather than shelter alone. It supported a life that did not aim to change with the seasons. Summer passed over it like light, passing through leaves, present, noticeable, ultimately irrelevant. The houses stayed low because they had learned something essential. Stability does not come from openness. It comes from knowing exactly how much space you need and refusing to ask for more. The longer light did not invite revision. It hovered outside the houses with a patience that suggested it might be waiting for permission that would never arrive. Walls stayed where they were, roof lines did not lift. No one looked at the season and decided this was the moment to change how shelter worked. The houses had already answered the question of what was necessary. Summer merely repeated the question in brighter handwriting and received the same response. There is something faintly ironic about how much light arrived and how little of it was claimed. Days stretched without restraint. Shadows moved slowly and then refused to disappear. Yet the interior remained dim in the familiar way that allowed work to continue without interruption. Openings were not widened, new gaps were not created. Light was allowed in only where it had already been proven useful. Anything more would have asked the house to participate in a mood rather than a function. That was not its role. People did not feel deprived by this. Deprivation requires awareness of what is missing. Here, awareness stayed narrow and practical. If something could be seen well enough to be used, then it was sufficient. Excess visibility did not translate into benefit. It translated into glare. The house protected its occupants from that with quiet competence. Summer offered brightness, and the house accepted only what could be tolerated without rearranging the day. No major repairs announced themselves either. The season did not inspire improvement. It inspired maintenance at the same measured pace. Loose boards were secured. Surfaces worn smooth by years of contact were left alone. Structural changes would have required planning and labor that offered no immediate return. Summer was long, but not generous. It extended time without extending energy. That distinction mattered. There was also the matter of memory. Houses here carried a record of decisions that had already been tested by colder conditions. Changing them in summer would have introduced uncertainty just before it became inconvenient. Stability was a form of foresight. Keeping the structure unchanged meant trusting that previous winters had already taught the necessary lessons. Summer did not argue against that logic. It simply passed through it. From outside, the settlement looked unchanged. From inside, it felt unchanged. This continuity was not celebrated. It was assumed. People moved through rooms the same way they always had. Hands found familiar surfaces. Feet adjusted to uneven floors without comment. The body recognized the space and relaxed into efficiency. New layouts would have required attention. Attention was reserved for tasks that could not be avoided. Light did enter in subtle ways. It lingered at thresholds. It traced the edges of objects before moving on. It never settled long enough to rearrange priorities. The house allowed it to exist without responding. This restraint kept the interior steady while the exterior changed around it. Summer could do what it liked outside. Inside, the rhythm remained intact. There is a gentle humor in this refusal. The sun arrives early and leaves late, as if making a case for importance. The house listens and then continues exactly as before. It does not close itself off completely. That would be rude. It also does not open itself fully. That would be impractical. The compromise has already been reached and does not require renegotiation each year. People adjusted their movements instead of the structure. Work was done earlier or later depending on comfort. Rest arrived when fatigue dictated it. The house did not need to participate in these adjustments. It stayed neutral. Its role was to hold the shape of life steady, while everything else shifted slightly around it. No one stood inside and imagined what the house could become. That kind of imagining belonged to places where change was expected. Here, expectation leaned toward repetition. The absence of renovation was not neglect. It was confidence. The structure had already proven adequate under worse conditions. Summer did not challenge adequacy. It merely highlighted it. This created a subtle tension between exterior abundance and interior restraint. The world outside was visible for longer hours. The world inside remained consistent. This contrast did not produce frustration. It produced clarity. There was a place for extended light, and it was not here. There was a place for continuity, and it was exactly here. As days stretched, the houses absorbed nothing extra. They did not collect more warmth than necessary. They did not store light. They did not attempt to translate season into comfort. Comfort had already been defined. It was familiarity. It was predictability. It was knowing that when you stepped inside, the environment would not ask anything new of you. In this way, summer became a test that required no response. It arrived with offerings, and the settlement declined politely. Not out of resistance, but out of understanding. The houses were not unfinished projects waiting for the right season. They were complete enough to ignore temptation. By the time the light began to recede again, there was nothing to undo. No seasonal additions needed to be removed. No adjustments needed to be reversed. The house had remained itself throughout. That continuity allowed the body to remain itself as well. So the season passed through the settlement like a visitor who stayed longer than expected but did not rearrange the furniture. Present, noticeable, ultimately uninvited into decision-making, the houses stood quietly, proving that not every change requires a reaction and not every abundance needs to be used. A day that passed without announcing itself. Morning did not arrive as an event. It arrived as a continuation. Eyes opened, not because light demanded it, but because bodies had decided long ago when it was time to move. The sun was already present somewhere beyond the trees, but it did not supervise the process. Habit did that more reliably. Limbs reached for familiar tasks without consultation. No one paused to acknowledge the season. Summer existed, but it did not give instructions. The first movements of the day followed paths worn smooth by repetition. Feet found the ground carefully and then without thinking. Hands reached for tools that had been placed in the same positions for years. There was no stretching to celebrate warmth, no lingering to appreciate brightness. The day began the way all days began, by continuing. Work started early but not urgently. Urgency suggests scarcity of time. Here time was present in abundance and therefore unremarkable. Tasks unfolded at a pace that assumed they would take as long as they took. No one hurried to outrun daylight. Daylight was not chasing anyone. It stayed long enough to remove excuses and then waited quietly to be ignored. The air felt warmer but not kinder. It did not lift spirits or loosen movements. It simply occupied more space around the body. Sweat appeared earlier and stayed longer. This was noted and accepted without commentary. Comfort was not expected. Endurance was more familiar. Summer offered heat and received tolerance in return. Conversations happened close to the body. Voices stayed low because the forest made shouting inefficient. Words did not travel far and did not need to. Anything important could be said within arm length. Anything less important could be left unsaid. This reduced noise and preserved energy. Even speech followed the principle of minimal effort. As the morning progressed, the work did not change. The same motions repeated with minor adjustments for heat and light. Shadows shifted slowly and then lingered in places that had been shaded earlier. No one tracked them. Time was measured by progress rather than position of the sun. When something was finished, it marked a moment. When it was not finished, the moment continued. There was a faint irony in how long the day lasted and how little of it was used for reflection. Extra hours did not invite contemplation. They invited continuation. More light meant more visibility, and more visibility meant fewer places for unfinished tasks to hide. Summer did not provide rest. It provided exposure. Midday did not announce itself either. It arrived when hunger suggested it might be time to pause. Eating happened without ceremony. Food tasted the same as it always did. Portions did not increase because the season was generous. Generosity was not assumed. Eating restored function, and then the day resumed its previous direction. After eating, the body moved a little slower. Heat encouraged caution. Movements became deliberate. No one mistook this for laziness. It was simply adaptation. The day allowed for it. There was no schedule to impress. Work would be done, or it would not. The sun had no opinion on the matter. The afternoon extended itself quietly. Light filtered through leaves and settled unevenly on the ground. Some areas brightened while others remained unchanged. This pattern did not inspire rearrangement. Tasks continued where they had already been assigned. The environment offered variation, and the settlement declined to respond. Children moved through the day with slightly more freedom, but not more purpose. They stayed outside longer because inside had not changed. Play adapted to the same spaces and the same rules. There was no sudden burst of seasonal joy. Energy was spent the way it always was, gradually. Older residents adjusted least of all. Their routines had been shaped by years that did not promise novelty. Summer was another layer added to experience, not a replacement for it. They moved with the confidence of knowing what the day would require before it asked. As evening approached, the light refused to fade quickly. It lingered as if curious. The settlement did not reward this curiosity. Work ended when bodies reached their limit, not when the sky suggested it was time. Inside the houses, darkness arrived earlier than outside. This contrast clarified priorities. Rest belonged indoors. Light could continue its performance alone. The evening did not feel longer. It felt diluted. Time spread thinner across more visible hours without gaining weight. Fatigue accumulated at the same rate. Sleep arrived on schedule. The body did not negotiate with the season. It followed its own agreements. There is a subtle humor in imagining the sun attempting to extend influence here. It stayed late and rose early, as if determined to matter. The settlement acknowledged its presence and then proceeded as usual. Light was allowed to exist without being obeyed. Night eventually settled in its quieter form, not fully dark but sufficient. The day closed without a conclusion. Nothing dramatic marked its end. No lesson was extracted. No moment was saved for memory. It had been a day like the others, and that was precisely its purpose. Tomorrow would begin the same way, not because imagination was lacking, but because continuity worked. Summer could offer as much light as it wanted. The day would still pass without announcing itself. Evening arrived later than it used to, and nothing adjusted to meet it. The light lingered as if expecting a response that never came. Shadows stretched across the ground and then stopped moving as quickly. The sky remained visible long after work had finished. None of this altered the rhythm inside the settlement. The body did not look to the horizon for permission. It relied on fatigue instead. When strength diminished, the day ended regardless of what the light was doing. There is a quiet mismatch here that never became a problem. The sun had surplus time. People did not. This imbalance was accepted without complaint. Extra light did not create extra capacity. It only revealed how finite energy remained. The day could stay open longer, but the human body closed itself on schedule. That schedule was older than any season and far more persuasive. Inside the houses, the change was even less noticeable. Darkness arrived at its usual pace. Walls did not reflect the lingering glow. Interior spaces followed their own logic. When lamps were not lit, tasks concluded. When tasks concluded, rest followed. The light outside could continue its extended presence without influencing this sequence. It was visible through openings, but it was not invited to interfere. No one decided to stay awake simply because it was still bright. Wakefulness was not a luxury. It was a resource spent carefully. Extending it without necessity would have felt wasteful. The sun could afford to linger. People could not afford to indulge curiosity about how long it might stay. There is something faintly ironic about this arrangement. The season offers more hours and receives no acknowledgement in return. It is not rejected, it is simply ignored. Light exists without authority. It illuminates without commanding. The settlement allows it to remain present, while refusing to let it dictate behavior. Children noticed the delay more than anyone else. They were outside when the light should have been fading and found that it was still there. This extended their movement slightly, not their freedom. Play ended when adults said it ended or when energy dissolved. The light was not consulted. It observed. Older residents barely registered the difference. Their evenings had always been shaped by habit rather than sky color. When it was time to rest, they rested. When it was time to stop, they stopped. The idea that evening might arrive later did not enter consideration. Evening arrived when the body said so. Work did not shift into the later hours. There was no second phase of productivity. The settlement did not treat the long evening as an opportunity. Opportunity suggests improvement. Improvement suggests risk. Nothing here required either. Work completed during the day was sufficient. Work left undone would remain undone regardless of illumination. This refusal to stretch the day was not stubbornness. It was calibration. People understood how much effort they could afford to expend without creating problems for the following morning. The sun could extend itself freely. Humans could not do so without consequences. The choice was practical rather than philosophical. As evening settled slowly, the outside world remained visible longer than expected. Trees stood clearly outlined. Paths remained easy to follow. There was no rush to retreat from darkness because darkness had not yet arrived. Still, the movement inward happened on schedule. Doors closed when they always did. Fires were prepared when they always were. The light outside did not delay these actions. It simply continued being present while they occurred. Inside conversations grew quieter, not because night demanded it, but because the day had already taken what it was going to take. Voices lowered as energy thinned. Words became economical. There was no sense of missing out on anything outside. The light did not promise entertainment. It offered only visibility. Visibility alone was not compelling enough to justify staying awake. The longer evening created a subtle tension between what could be done and what should be done. The settlement resolved this by doing nothing new. It treated the surplus light as background rather than invitation. The day had been defined by work. The evening was defined by recovery. Light did not alter that agreement. Eventually, the sky dimmed enough to align with interior conditions. The mismatch resolved itself quietly. The sun retreated without commentary. It did not protest the lack of attention. It had done its part by staying longer. The settlement had done its part by continuing as planned. There is a gentle humor in imagining the sun disappointed. It arrived early and stayed late, as if hoping someone would notice the effort. The settlement noticed and then declined to change anything. Time was not expanded simply because light suggested it could be. The human schedule remained finite and carefully protected. Sleep arrived without drama. Bodies settled into rest, as they always had. The day closed without ceremony. The extended light did not produce extended memory. No one would later recall a specific evening when the sun stayed too long. It happened too often to deserve distinction. In this way, the long evening passed as quietly as the rest of the day, present, slightly excessive, ultimately irrelevant. The sun had extra time to spend. The settlement did not. And that difference shaped everything without ever needing to be discussed. Work that refused to feel seasonal. Summer labor in the settlement did not announce itself as a special category. It did not feel lighter or faster or more optimistic. It simply continued. The tasks were the same ones that existed before the air warmed, and they would remain after it cooled again. Wood still needed cutting, tools still needed repair, materials still needed shaping. None of this gained urgency from the season. None of it gained relief either. Chopping wood in summer lacked drama. The sound was dull rather than sharp because the forest absorbed it quickly. Each strike landed with the same weight, regardless of temperature. Sweat appeared sooner and stayed longer, but the pace did not change to accommodate discomfort. Work was done until it was done. The body adjusted in small ways without complaint. Complaints would not have shortened the task. There was no sense of racing against time. That feeling belonged to places where harvests depended on narrow windows. Here, labor did not compete with the calendar. Wood could be cut tomorrow as easily as today. Tools could be repaired when they failed rather than when the season suggested they should. Summer did not threaten loss if effort slowed. It only removed excuses for delay. This created an unusual calm around work. Calm did not mean ease. It meant absence of panic. No one worked as if something terrible would happen if they stopped for a moment. The forest would still be there. The house would still need maintenance. The task would still wait, with the same patience it had yesterday. Repair work followed the same logic. A handle cracked from use was fixed when it became inconvenient, not when it became symbolic. There was no ritual to seasonal upkeep. Nothing was ceremonially prepared for winter while summer was still present. That kind of forward planning implied surplus energy. Here, energy was measured carefully and spent only where necessary. Raw materials were processed slowly. Wood was shaped with movements that had been learned over years. Speed did not improve quality. Rushing created waste. Summer heat did not change that equation. If anything, it encouraged caution. Tired muscles made mistakes more likely. Mistakes created more work later. Slowing down was not laziness. It was efficiency stretched across time. There is a mild irony in how often summer labor is imagined as productive and urgent. In this settlement, it was neither. Productivity existed, but it was steady rather than accelerated. The season did not motivate ambition. It simply allowed the same amount of work to be done under brighter conditions. Visibility improved. Outcomes did not. Tools were handled with familiarity rather than intensity. Hands moved without thought. The body remembered angles and pressure without needing instruction. This reduced strain. Thinking less conserved energy. The work became almost automatic, which was precisely the point. Automatic labor left room for endurance. No one spoke about working harder because it was summer. That idea would have sounded strange. Harder compared to what? Work was already hard enough. Making it harder would not produce benefits. Making it steadier produced survival. Summer did not inspire overachievement. It reinforced consistency. Breaks happened naturally, not scheduled. When heat accumulated and attention drifted, movement slowed. A pause occurred. Then work resumed. There was no guilt attached to stopping briefly. The day was long. Tasks were not running away. Rest was part of labor, not its opposite. This approach removed pressure from the season itself. Summer was not expected to deliver progress. It did not promise improvement. It simply allowed tasks to continue without cold interference. That was enough. Expecting more would have created disappointment. The settlement preferred predictability. The absence of rush also shaped how people moved through shared space. No one bumped into anyone else with urgency. Tools were passed carefully. Paths were followed patiently. Speed offered no advantage in an environment where obstacles were constant. Moving quickly only increased risk. Children observed this rhythm and absorbed it without explanation. They learned that work did not need dramatic motivation. It needed persistence. They learned that finishing something mattered more than finishing it quickly. Summer did not contradict these lessons. It repeated them with better lighting. Older residents worked more slowly but not less effectively. Experience compensated for reduced strength. Their movements were efficient because they avoided unnecessary effort. Summer heat did not encourage them to stop. It encouraged them to simplify. Fewer motions, fewer repetitions. The same result. There was no celebration of completed tasks. Finishing work did not feel like achievement. It felt like closure. Something no longer required attention. That relief was quiet. It did not demand recognition. Summer did not turn labor into a source of pride. It turned it into something manageable. By late afternoon, the work eased, not because the day suggested it, but because the body did. Muscles reached their limit. Focus softened. Continuing would have reduced quality. Stopping preserved energy for tomorrow. The sun could remain present without influencing that decision. In this way, summer labor passed without acquiring seasonal identity. It was not framed as opportunity or burden. It was simply what needed doing under slightly warmer conditions. The forest did not care how fast tasks were completed. The settlement did not either. There is something faintly humorous in how often the season is credited with productivity. Here, productivity existed in spite of the season rather than because of it. Summer provided light and received indifference. Work continued at the same pace. That pace had already been calibrated long before anyone thought to name the months. When the day ended, there was no sense of having used summer well or wasted it. That kind of evaluation required a different relationship with time. Here, time was not a resource to maximize. It was a condition to move through carefully. Labor followed that understanding faithfully. So wood was cut, tools were repaired, materials were shaped. Summer watched quietly. Nothing hurried. Nothing paused dramatically. Work refused to feel seasonal, and in doing so, it remained sustainable. The repetition did not feel monotonous because it was never framed as something to escape. It simply existed as the most reliable way to get through the day without unnecessary loss. The same motions returned again and again with small variations that were noticed only by the body performing them. Hands adjusted grip without instruction. Muscles learned where to pause and where to continue. Nothing new was introduced because nothing new was required. There was a particular slowness to this repetition that summer did not disrupt. The pace was already calibrated to endurance rather than speed. Light extending into the evening did not make movements faster. It only made them visible for longer. This created a subtle illusion that more was happening when in fact the same amount of work was being done at the same rate. The sun stayed awake longer. The labor did not. Sweat became a companion rather than a signal. It appeared early and stayed without complaint. No one interpreted it as proof of productivity. It was simply the body responding to conditions. Wiping it away did not increase output. Ignoring it did not reduce it. Summer offered heat and the body adapted quietly. There was no sense of overcoming anything. Endurance replaced ambition. The work repeated because repetition worked. Each cycle refined the next. Waste decreased. Errors became less frequent. This efficiency did not accelerate production. It stabilized it. The goal was not to finish more, but to finish without damage. Tools lasted longer when treated predictably. Bodies lasted longer when not pushed beyond familiarity. There is a faint humor in how the extended daylight created the impression of opportunity. The shadows stretched farther across the ground and stayed there, as if waiting for someone to take advantage of them. Instead, they simply grew tired alongside the people who cast them. The longer light did not energize. It prolonged fatigue. The day became wider without becoming lighter. People noticed this without discussing it. No one remarked that the day felt long. That would have implied surprise. Length was expected. Capacity was not. The body closed its accounts at the same hour, regardless of how much light remained unused. This was not resistance, it was accounting. As tasks repeated, the mind withdrew slightly. Attention narrowed to what was directly in front of it. This made the work bearable. Thinking beyond the task would have created friction. Planning beyond necessity introduced risk. The repetition allowed thought to rest while the body continued. This was not boredom, it was efficiency at a psychological level. Children absorbed this rhythm naturally. They saw the same actions repeated without explanation and learned that this was not punishment. It was maintenance. They learned that progress did not always look like movement forward. Sometimes it looked like staying where you were and making sure nothing collapsed. Summer did not contradict this lesson. It reinforced it by doing nothing to change the pattern. Older residents relied on repetition even more heavily. It reduced uncertainty. New methods required experimentation. Experimentation required energy. Energy was reserved for things that could not be avoided. Repetition conserved strength and protected joints and kept mistakes within tolerable limits. Summer heat did not invite innovation. It encouraged familiarity. The forest reinforced this logic. Paths changed subtly as growth shifted. Adjusting movement became a daily necessity. Repetition was never identical. It was adaptive without being inventive. The same task encountered slightly different resistance each time. Roots grew, soil softened, branches leaned. The body responded automatically. This constant minor adjustment prevented stagnation without demanding creativity. There was no reward attached to finishing a task quickly. Finishing at all was sufficient. Finishing well was preferable. Finishing without injury mattered most. The day did not applaud speed. The environment punished carelessness. Summer did not soften those consequences. It simply revealed them under brighter conditions. The extended daylight also exposed unfinished work more clearly. Tools left out were visible longer. Materials not stored properly remained noticeable. This did not create urgency. It created mild annoyance. Annoyance motivated completion more reliably than enthusiasm ever could. Summer provided visibility. Habit provided resolution. As the day progressed, fatigue accumulated evenly. It did not spike. It settled. The body recognized its limits and adjusted without drama. Movements shortened, pauses lengthened. This was not a failure of will. It was an understanding of consequence. Pushing harder now would cost more tomorrow. The repetition had taught that lesson thoroughly. There is something quietly ironic about how much light the season provided and how little of it was converted into extra output. The sun extended itself generously. The settlement accepted the offer and did nothing additional with it. The excess simply existed as background. Light became another constant rather than a catalyst. Even the idea of productivity felt different here. Productivity was not measured by volume, but by continuity. A task done today that could be done again tomorrow without complication was considered successful. Summer did not change that metric. It did not raise expectations. It did not lower them either. By late afternoon, the repetition became heavier, not slower, heavier. Each movement required slightly more intention. This weight was familiar and therefore manageable. The body recognized it as a signal to begin closing the day rather than expanding it. Light remaining outside did not argue. It stayed present without persuasion. The longer shadows became companions rather than warnings. They stretched alongside the workers and seemed to share the same exhaustion. There was no race between body and sun. The race had been canceled long ago by mutual indifference. The day ended when it always ended. When work finally stopped, it did not feel earned in a dramatic sense. It felt appropriate. The repetition had reached its natural conclusion for the day. Continuing would not have improved outcomes. Stopping preserved balance. Summer could keep shining without affecting that decision. In this way, repetition functioned as protection. It shielded people from the illusion that more time meant more capacity. It reminded them that effort had limits regardless of conditions. The season offered light. The body offered endurance. The settlement chose endurance. So the tasks returned tomorrow exactly as they had today. The same motions, the same adjustments, the same quiet competence. Summer would still be there extending its hours. The repetition would still be there absorbing them without comment. And the work would continue not because the season encouraged it, but because continuity required it. Summer meals that never learned to celebrate. Food did not become more interesting when summer arrived. It became more visible. Portions increased slightly because bodies demanded it. The list of ingredients did not. There was no sudden appearance of variety, no surprise flavors, no seasonal excitement. The same foods returned again and again with minor adjustments in quantity rather than type. Summer did not introduce abundance. It introduced repetition at a steadier pace. Meals were not framed as events. They were interruptions between work that allowed the body to continue functioning. Eating happened because hunger insisted, not because pleasure invited it. The settlement did not gather around food with anticipation. It gathered with efficiency. Meals arrived when they were needed and ended when they had served their purpose. No one lingered for conversation shaped by taste. There is a gentle irony in how often summer is imagined as generous. Here, generosity was measured carefully. More daylight allowed more work, and more work required more food. That was the extent of the calculation. Summer increased frequency, not variety. The same dish appeared again later in the day, rather than something new appearing once. The food itself carried no symbolism. It was not tied to the season. It did not announce that summer had arrived. Ingredients were chosen for reliability rather than novelty. What could be stored was valued. What could be preserved mattered. Freshness was tolerated but not relied upon. Summer did not persuade anyone to redesign their diet. It simply tested whether existing habits could endure warmer conditions. Eating felt practical rather than social. People sat close enough to share space but not to perform togetherness. Conversation remained minimal. Talking required energy that was better spent elsewhere. Chewing did not invite commentary. Taste was registered and then dismissed. The goal was not satisfaction. The goal was continuation. Children learned early that food was not entertainment. It was fuel delivered in familiar forms. Summer did not change this lesson. It reinforced it by offering the same meals more often. A bowl that appeared once a day now appeared twice. No one pretended this was exciting. It was acknowledged quietly as necessary. There was no concept of a summer meal worth remembering, no dish associated with warmth or light. Memory attached itself to effort rather than flavor. Food supported that effort without asking to be noticed. The absence of celebration was not deprivation. It was consistency. The preparation of food followed the same pattern. Movements were learned and repeated. Nothing about summer required experimentation. Cooking did not become lighter or more creative. Heat already existed in abundance. Adding more for pleasure felt unnecessary. Meals were prepared with the same caution as tools were handled. Mistakes cost energy and resources. Predictability reduced waste. There's a subtle humor in how often abundance is imagined as choice. Here abundance was measured in reliability. Knowing that food would appear in familiar form provided reassurance. Variety would have required planning and risk. Risk was reserved for situations that offered real return. Taste did not qualify. Summer also did not introduce indulgence. There was no idea of eating more because conditions were favorable. Eating more meant working more later. Balance was maintained carefully. The body received enough to continue and not enough to slow it down. Satisfaction was not the objective. Stability was. Food smells did not linger differently in summer. They mixed with the same layers of smoke and wood and dampness. Heat warmed them slightly and then let them fade. No aroma dominated long enough to demand attention. Eating did not reshape the environment. It passed through it quietly. Meals happened at consistent times. Hunger arrived according to effort rather than hour. When it arrived, food followed. When it passed, work resumed. Summer did not delay or advance this rhythm. The longer day did not introduce extra meals out of celebration. It introduced extra meals out of necessity. That distinction mattered. There was no table set differently for summer, no rearrangement of space, no invitation for the season to participate. Food was consumed in the same places and the same postures. Sitting was brief. Standing was common. Comfort was not pursued. Efficiency was. Older residents ate with familiarity rather than appetite. They knew what to expect and adjusted their intake accordingly. Summer heat did not improve enjoyment. It reduced tolerance for excess. Eating just enough became more important when warmth pressed on the body. Heavy meals slowed movement. That was avoided. Children noticed that food appeared more often but tasted the same. This taught them something quietly important. Pleasure was not guaranteed by frequency. Repetition could be abundant without becoming enjoyable. Summer did not promise delight. It promised endurance. There is a mild irony in the idea of summer feasting. The settlement did not recognize the concept. Feasting implied surplus and rest. Here, surplus was absorbed immediately by continued labor. Rest remained scheduled rather than spontaneous. Food served maintenance, not reward. The simplicity of meals reduced decision-making. No one asked what they wanted to eat. Wanting was not consulted. Eating occurred because it needed to. This removed a layer of distraction. The mind could remain focused on what came before and after the meal rather than the meal itself. Summer heat made this efficiency even more appealing. Prolonged cooking would have increased discomfort. Simple preparation conserved energy. Meals were warm when needed and otherwise left alone. No one sought culinary improvement. As the weather changed, improvement suggested risk. Risk suggested cost. There was no complaint about monotony. Complaint would have implied expectation. Expectation would have implied disappointment. Neither had a place here. Acceptance was more useful. The settlement accepted that summer did not bring better food. It brought the same food more often. That was enough. As days stretched longer, the meals blended together. Breakfast did not feel distinct from later eating. The same textures returned. The same motions repeated. Eating became another form of repetition that supported the larger rhythm of the day. Summer did not interrupt this. It reinforced it. There is something quietly calming about this absence of culinary drama. Food did not demand memory or attention. It appeared and disappeared without leaving emotional residue. The body registered nourishment and moved on. Summer did not complicate that transaction. When evening arrived and eating concluded, there was no sense of having enjoyed or endured a meal. There was only the knowledge that hunger had been addressed. That knowledge allowed rest to begin without distraction. Satisfaction was functional rather than emotional. In this way, summer meals passed without learning to celebrate themselves. They did not seek recognition. They did not aspire to meaning. They did their work and disappeared. Summer offered frequency and received indifference in return. The old dishes returned again the next day, not because imagination was lacking, but because reliability mattered more. Summer did not teach the settlement to enjoy food. It taught it to rely on it. And reliance was the quiet foundation that allowed everything else to continue without collapse. Time remembered by what was finished. Time did not present itself as something to be noticed. It did not arrive wearing the shape of a season or the promise of a change. It moved quietly through the settlement the way smoke moved through wood, slowly, invisibly, leaving traces only where something had been altered. People did not speak of time as passing. They spoke of tasks being done. That was how memory was formed, not by dates or length of days, but by evidence that effort had ended. A repaired tool carried more weight than any recollection of weather. A handle smoothed by use told a clearer story than the position of the sun. When someone looked back, they did not remember whether the light had stayed late or faded early. They remembered that a blade had finally stopped catching, that a roof no longer leaked, that a stack of wood stood ready and unmoving. Time became visible only when it had been converted into something stable. This approach removed urgency from memory. There was no need to label days or mark weeks. Nothing required tracking unless it changed the condition of work. A day was complete when a task no longer demanded attention. Another day began when something else did. The order mattered more than the duration. How long it took was less important than, is it finished? The season did not organize these memories. Summer did not claim responsibility for progress. Winter did not receive blame for delay. Tasks existed independently of the sky. They waited with patience that ignored light and temperature. When completed, they marked time. When unfinished, they extended it. This created a curious relationship with the past. Looking back meant scanning objects rather than calendars. A repaired fence said more about last month than any sense of warmth or cold. Wood stacked neatly recalled effort spent rather than days endured. Memory became physical. It sat quietly in the corner and did not demand narration. There is a mild irony in this. Modern thinking often treats time as something that must be managed. Here, time was something that dissolved naturally once its material had been shaped. When nothing remained undone, the day released itself. When something remained, the day lingered, regardless of light. Children learned this without instruction. They saw that adults spoke of time by pointing, not at the sky, but at things. This was done then. That was finished yesterday. The language of memory attached itself to objects rather than experiences. An item fixed last week mattered more than a warm afternoon that had passed without result. This also reduced nostalgia. Longing requires contrast. Here contrast was minimal. Days differed only in what they produced. A day that resulted in nothing new faded quickly. A day that resulted in something finished remained present. Time sorted itself according to usefulness rather than emotion. Even summer with its extended light failed to reshape this logic. The long day did not feel longer if it ended with the same amount accomplished. Light was background. Completion was foreground. A bright day that ended unfinished felt incomplete. A dim day that ended with a task resolved felt full. The body responded to this measure instinctively. Fatigue was tolerated if something was nearing completion. Fatigue felt heavier when nothing had moved closer to resolution. This created an internal sense of time that had nothing to do with hours. It had everything to do with closure. There was no pressure to remember days for their own sake. Memory was not cultivated. It emerged accidentally when something durable existed. A repaired tool stayed. A corrected mistake stopped repeating. These were the moments that lasted. Everything else dissolved without resistance. This also made forgetting easier. Days without consequence slipped away quietly. No one tried to hold on to them. They were not failures. They were simply days where effort maintained rather than transformed. Maintenance did not produce memory. It produced continuity. Continuity did not need to be recalled. It needed to persist. There is something quietly calming about this arrangement. Time does not accumulate as anxiety. It does not pile up demanding recognition. It flows into work and disappears. Only when work resists completion does time seem to linger. When something is finished, time releases its grip immediately. The settlement trusted this system because it worked. It removed the burden of reflection. No one needed to ask where the time had gone. It had gone into the wood that no longer creaked, into the tool that no longer slipped, into the structure that no longer needed attention. Time was not lost. It was stored. Summer could stretch itself as much as it liked. The extra light did not create extra memory unless it resulted in extra completion. Otherwise, it remained unused. The sun could remain visible, while time remained unchanged. That distinction mattered. There is a gentle humor in how inefficient the sky appeared compared to human effort. The sun spent hours illuminating things that did not change. People spent fewer hours altering what mattered. Which one measured time more effectively was never in question. Even conversation reflected this. People did not reminisce about days. They referenced outcomes. When something had been done, it was spoken of briefly and then released. When something remained undone, it returned to speech until resolved. Language followed the same logic as memory. This way of measuring time also softened disappointment. A slow day was not a wasted day if something small was completed. A fast day was not a success if nothing reached conclusion. Evaluation stayed grounded. The scale was modest. Expectations stayed realistic. As seasons moved quietly through the settlement, this method remained unchanged. Summer did not demand celebration. Winter did not demand explanation. Time was not experienced as passing through the body. It was experienced as leaving marks behind. At the end of a day when work stopped, there was no sense of watching time close. There was only the sense that something no longer needed attention. That was enough. Rest arrived not because the hour was late, but because nothing remained urgent. In this way, time learned to stay quiet. It did not insist on being noticed. It accepted being translated into objects and results. The settlement did not remember days. It remembered what no longer needed to be done. The season did not leave behind a shape that could be pointed to later. It did not condense into a phrase or attach itself to a single finished object. When people looked back, there was no clear edge where summer began and no cleaner edge where it ended. The days blurred together, not because they were identical, but because none of them demanded distinction. The season functioned as a long continuation rather than an episode. This made remembering unnecessary. Memory usually gathers around disruption or reward. Summer offered neither. It provided conditions that allowed existing routines to continue without interruption. That was its entire contribution. The settlement accepted it the way it accepted air, present, useful, ultimately unremarkable. No one said remember that summer. There was nothing specific to remember. The light stayed longer, the work stayed the same, food appeared more often. Fatigue behaved as expected. When the season moved on, it did so without removing anything that had not already been temporary. There was no residue, no emotional debris, no story asking to be told later. People did not frame the year by seasons in conversation. They framed it by outcomes. The roof that was repaired sometime before the cold returned. the tool that stopped failing around the same period. Summer existed only as the background that allowed these things to happen. It did not claim authorship. This absence of a marker reduced the temptation to romanticize. There was no reason to look back fondly or critically. Summer did not improve life enough to be praised. It did not disrupt it enough to be blamed. It performed exactly the role assigned to it by habit and then stepped aside. If seasons had intentions, this one kept them private. There is a mild irony in how carefully the sun followed its schedule. It arrived early, it stayed late, it invested time generously, and yet the settlement did not respond with narrative. The effort went unnoticed, not out of ingratitude but out of alignment. The sun did what suns do. People did what people do. Neither expected applause. The lack of a defining summer also simplified the past. When someone spoke of earlier years, they did not reference summers or winters. They referenced what had changed and what had not. Memory organized itself around continuity rather than contrast. This made time feel smoother, less segmented, more like a steady surface than a series of steps. Children grew up without learning to name seasons as experiences. They learned them as conditions. Summer meant more light and more work and the same meals appearing again. It did not mean freedom. It did not mean pause. It meant continuity with better visibility. That lesson stayed with them quietly. Older residents rarely spoke of summers at all. When asked about earlier times, they spoke of effort and completion, of how long something took to fix, of when a particular problem finally stopped returning. The weather might have been warm or cold, but that detail rarely survived the telling. It had not altered the outcome. This way of remembering protected the settlement from disappointment. There was no expectation that a season would deliver something memorable. When nothing memorable happened, there was no sense of loss. The season had done its job. It had passed. That was enough. It also protected the future. Without a celebrated past summer, there was no pressure on the next one to compare favorably. Each season arrived free of expectation. It did not have to live up to anything. It only had to provide conditions that were already understood. There is something quietly humorous in how efficiently the season disappeared. It passed without demanding attention and left without requiring closure. It behaved exactly like a function. It enabled work. It maintained conditions. Then it withdrew. No ceremony. No farewell. People did not mark the last long evening. They did not notice the moment when nights began to return earlier. The change happened gradually enough to avoid comment. One day light faded sooner. The next day it faded a little sooner still. The body adjusted without discussion. There was no announcement that summer was over. There was only a new normal. Because there was no marker, there was also no nostalgia. Longing requires something to reach for. Here, there was nothing to grasp. The season had not offered anything unique. It had offered duration. Duration alone does not create attachment. It creates familiarity. Familiarity dissolves quietly. This lack of seasonal identity also influenced how people thought about the future. They did not plan for summer as a special time. They planned for tasks. If those tasks happened to occur under longer light, that was acceptable. If not, they would happen anyway. The season did not dictate ambition. Even language reflected this. No one said, "Last summer we did this." They said when that was finished, or before the cold returned, or after the repair was complete. Time was anchored to necessity rather than memory. Summer existed only as the space between requirements. There is a calm hidden inside this approach. Without seasons competing for significance, the year becomes less dramatic. Life moves forward without peaks that demand emotional investment. This does not make it dull. It makes it manageable. Each period performs its role and exits quietly. Summer did not ask to be remembered, and the settlement respected that request. It allowed the season to pass without forcing meaning onto it. Meaning was reserved for things that altered conditions permanently. Summer did not qualify. When the light shortened again, it did not feel like loss. Nothing had been taken away. The work continued, meals continued, rest continued. The day simply adjusted its visible boundaries. Inside those boundaries, life remained familiar. This continuity reduced anxiety. There was no sense of missing a chance, no regret that something had not been enjoyed. Enjoyment had never been promised. The season had delivered exactly what it was meant to deliver, and nothing more. There is a final irony in this efficiency. The season performed its function so completely that it erased itself. By doing its job well, it left no trace worth naming. A summer that passes correctly leaves nothing behind except the conditions required for the next season to do the same. So when people later tried to recall when something had happened they did not say during that summer, they said before it was fixed or after it stopped being a problem. The season remained unnamed. It had slipped through memory without resistance. In this way, summer became the quietest part of the year. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened as expected. It moved through the settlement like a well-trained process. Executed, completed, released. A season passed exactly according to its purpose, which was simply to pass. Children and elders moving at the same speed. Children in the settlement did not experience summer as a break. There was no concept of time off, waiting for them. The season did not arrive with permission to stop doing what was already expected. Summer simply extended the daylight, and the children responded by remaining visible for longer periods. They were outside more often not because they were free, but because nothing told them to go inside yet. Play did not change shape. It did not become louder or more ambitious. It simply lasted longer before ending. The same spaces were used, the same movements repeated. Sticks became tools, and then returned to being sticks. Paths were followed because they already existed. The forest did not become a playground. It remained an environment that tolerated small bodies moving through it without enthusiasm. Children learned early that daylight did not equal freedom. It equaled exposure. Being outside longer meant being seen longer. This did not encourage mischief, it encouraged familiarity. The settlement watched without watching closely. Children moved within boundaries that were understood rather than enforced. Summer did not loosen these boundaries. It illuminated them. There was no anticipation attached to the season. Children did not count days until summer began, because nothing began. Their responsibilities remained modest but constant, carrying small items, observing work, staying out of the way without disappearing. Summer did not remove these expectations, it gave them more hours in which to meet them. They did not ask when summer would end. They did not need to know. The length of the day mattered less than the rhythm of the household. When adults slowed, children slowed. When adults moved, children adjusted. The sun had little authority here. Behavior followed bodies, not skies. Older residents existed at the opposite end of the same rhythm. Their days had already become condensed by experience. Movement was deliberate. Energy was spent carefully. Summer did not invite them to expand their activity. It asked nothing of them, and they responded by changing nothing. They did not stay outside longer simply because it was light. They stayed where it was comfortable and familiar. Their routines had been shaped by decades of repetition. Extending them would have required effort that offered no reward. Summer did not provide incentive. It provided warmth that needed managing. There is a quiet symmetry in how children and elders responded similarly for different reasons. Children stayed out longer because they had energy to spend. Elders stayed in because they knew how limited that energy could be. Both followed internal logic rather than seasonal suggestion. Summer adjusted itself around them rather than the other way around. Older residents often watched the children without comment, not out of sentiment, but out of habit. Children were part of the environment like trees and paths. Their movement was expected. Their presence was not remarkable. Summer did not change that relationship. It simply made it visible for more hours. The elders did not offer lessons about summer. There was nothing to explain. The season did not require interpretation. It arrived, it stayed, it left. Experience had taught them that commentary did not improve outcomes. They conserved words the way they conserved motion. Children learned from this silence. They absorbed the idea that not everything needed explanation. Summer did not come with stories. It came with conditions. Those conditions were navigated quietly. Learning happened through observation rather than instruction. The absence of a summer break meant there was no return, either. Children did not experience a shift back into routine because routine had never paused. Their days flowed continuously. One day resembled the next, with small adjustments for weather and light. This continuity prevented disruption. There was no transition to manage. Elders appreciated this stability even if they never named it. Predictability reduced strain. Each day asked roughly the same amount. Summer did not increase demands. It simply removed certain obstacles like cold. That removal did not create opportunity. It created consistency. Meals were taken at the same times for both groups. Children ate when hunger arrived. Elders ate when habit dictated. Summer did not delay or advance these moments. Food appeared according to effort rather than light. Eating did not become a social event. It remained functional across generations. Rest followed the same pattern. Children slept when energy was gone. Elders slept when fatigue insisted. The sky could remain bright outside without influencing this decision. Summer evenings extended, but bedtime did not. Both groups trusted their bodies more than the season. There is a mild irony in how often childhood is imagined as carefree. Here childhood was light, not free. Children carried fewer responsibilities, but they still carried some. Summer did not remove them. It revealed them more clearly. Longer days meant longer periods of observation. Behavior adjusted accordingly. For elders, the irony moved in the opposite direction. Summer is often imagined as rejuvenating. Here it was simply warm. Warmth required adjustment, hydration, slower movement, more frequent rest. Rejuvenation was not assumed. Maintenance was. The two age groups shared a similar understanding of time. Neither counted days. Neither marked seasons emotionally. Children lived in the present because they had not yet learned to measure beyond it. Elders lived in the present because they no longer needed to. Summer passed through both, without leaving a mark. This created a settlement where age did not divide experience as sharply as one might expect. Both ends of life moved according to internal signals rather than external calendars. Summer did not privilege one group over the other. It offered light to everyone and demanded nothing in return. Children eventually went inside when told or when tired. Elders remained inside when comfortable. These choices were not influenced by how bright the sky remained. Light was background. The body was foreground. As the season progressed, the pattern repeated daily. Children outside longer, elders unchanged. No conflict emerged from this difference. It was understood. Summer allowed variation without forcing adjustment. When the light eventually shortened again, children adjusted without complaint. Elders noticed only because shadows moved differently. There was no sense of loss or relief. The rhythm simply shifted slightly, and life continued. In this way, summer revealed something quiet about the settlement. Age did not determine how one experienced the season. Energy and habit did. Children had more of one. Elders relied on the other. Summer accommodated both by remaining indifferent. The season did not cater to youth or comfort age. It remained neutral. Those who could spend energy did so. Those who could not conserved it. The sun provided time. Humans decided how little of it they could afford to use. So children stayed out longer without gaining freedom. Elders stayed in without missing anything. Both moved through summer without naming it. And when it passed, neither group felt the need to remember it. The older residents did not treat summer as an arrival. They treated it as a continuation that required no acknowledgement. Habits remained intact, not out of stubbornness, but out of trust. These habits had already carried them through years that demanded more adjustment than this season ever would. Changing them now would have introduced uncertainty where none was needed. They woke at the same hour, not because the light told them to, but because the body remembered. Sleep ended when it always had. The sky might already be bright or still undecided. Either way, it did not matter. Movement followed routine rather than atmosphere. The first steps of the day were careful and familiar. Nothing about summer made them faster or slower. It simply made them visible sooner. There was no sense of renewed energy. Summer did not arrive with a promise to restore strength. It arrived warm and remained warm, and that warmth required management rather than celebration. Heat pressed gently but persistently. The older bodies responded by conserving motion. They did not expand activity to meet the season. They reduced unnecessary movement to preserve comfort. This was not withdrawal, it was efficiency, refined by experience. Energy was spent where it mattered and withheld where it did not. Walking was slower because it needed to be. Sitting occurred more often because it was useful. Summer did not invite longer days. It invited careful ones. The idea that summer might refresh the spirit would have sounded strange here. Refreshment implies replenishment. Replenishment requires surplus. Older residents lived by balance rather than surplus. They knew how easily balance could be lost. Summer heat threatened that balance more than it supported it. Warmth did not revive. It demanded adaptation. They did not linger outside simply because it was pleasant. Pleasantness was not the standard. Comfort was. Shade mattered more than sunlight. Stillness mattered more than visibility. They chose places where the body could remain stable without effort. Summer provided options, and they selected the least demanding ones. Conversation did not change with the season. It remained sparse and practical. Words were exchanged when necessary and withheld when not. Summer did not encourage storytelling. There was nothing new to narrate. The season did not introduce events. It introduced conditions that were handled quietly. There is a mild irony in how often summer is associated with vitality. Here, vitality was measured differently. It was measured by how little strain was added to the day. A good day was one that required no recovery. Summer made this more difficult rather than easier. The sun stayed longer. The body did not. Older residents understood this instinctively. They did not attempt to match the energy of the season. They allowed the season to pass around them. This was not resignation, it was calibration. They had learned that resisting conditions was more exhausting than adapting to them. While children extended their presence outside, elders remained anchored to familiar spaces. This difference did not create distance, it created balance. The settlement held both patterns without conflict. Youth spent energy. Age conserved it. Summer did not favor one approach over the other. It simply revealed both more clearly. There was one group that seemed to enjoy the season without hesitation. Insects multiplied and moved with enthusiasm that bordered on optimism. They appeared everywhere, with a confidence that suggested summer had been designed for them specifically. They buzzed and crawled and insisted on presence without invitation. This was noticed with dry acceptance. No one remarked on it loudly. Insects were tolerated rather than admired. Their enjoyment was obvious and slightly irritating. They did not require rest. They did not pace themselves. They behaved as if the extra light had been provided for their convenience alone. Older residents adjusted accordingly. Windows were covered when needed. Skin was protected. Movement became even more deliberate. Summer belonged to insects in a way it did not belong to humans. This imbalance was acknowledged without envy. Wanting what insects had would have been impractical. There is something faintly humorous about this division. The sun stayed late, humans conserved energy, insects celebrated without restraint. Only one of these responses appeared joyful. It was also the least sustainable. No one attempted to imitate it. The presence of insects reinforced the elders' habits. Stillness reduced attention. Calm movement attracted less interference. Quick gestures invited notice. Summer rewarded patience by making everything else more active. The elders adapted by becoming quieter. Meals were eaten the same way. Portions adjusted slightly, but timing did not. Hunger arrived as it always did. Eating occurred without ceremony. Summer heat reduced appetite rather than increasing it. Food was taken carefully to avoid discomfort. There was no indulgence. The body required maintenance, not reward. Rest came at familiar hours. Evening might arrive later outside, but inside nothing changed. The elders did not stay awake longer simply because the light persisted. Wakefulness was not a luxury. It was a responsibility. Sleeping at the usual time preserved stability. Summer did not earn an exception. The insects continued regardless. They filled the long evenings with sound that never fully faded. This noise was accepted as part of the environment rather than a disruption. Complaining would not have reduced it. Acceptance required less effort. There is a quiet lesson here that no one articulated. Summer does not bring energy. It reveals how energy is managed. Youth spends it. Age protects it. Insects ignore the concept entirely. Each approach functions within its own limits. The elders did not romanticize their restraint. They did not frame it as wisdom. It was simply how life had taught them to remain comfortable. Summer heat punished excess. Conserving energy avoided that punishment. The lesson had been learned long ago and did not need repeating. As days passed, the pattern remained stable. Elders moved the same way. Children adapted within their bounds. Insects thrived until they did not. The season continued without asking for recognition. When summer eventually withdrew, it did not take anything with it. The elders' habits remained. The insects disappeared gradually. The rhythm adjusted without difficulty. Nothing had been invested that needed reclaiming. This is perhaps the most unsettling part. Summer did not leave an impression because it had not been allowed to reshape behavior. The elders had refused to give it that authority. They moved through it unchanged. The season offered extended light. The elders responded with extended caution. Only the insects seemed to enjoy the exchange, and even that enjoyment was brief. So summer passed quietly through older bodies that neither welcomed nor resisted it. It stayed. It warmed. It irritated. It left. Habits remained exactly where they had been. Night that arrived. Late and changed nothing. Darkness arrived later than expected and found that nothing was waiting for it. The sky held its light well into the hour when activity would normally have ended. This delay did not create confusion. It created confirmation. The settlement had already decided when the day was finished, and the sky was simply catching up. Light lingered outside as if it had unfinished business. It touched trees and paths and roofs with patience. Inside the houses, this persistence meant very little. Interior spaces followed their own rhythm. When tasks were done, lamps were not lit to continue them. Continuing would have required energy that was already accounted for. The day had reached its limit regardless of visibility. There is a subtle irony in how the night behaved. It arrived late but did not bring permission. The light outside suggested possibility. The body responded with fatigue. Fatigue was the authority here. It did not negotiate with brightness. It ended the day without apology. People did not stay awake simply because it was still possible to see. Visibility alone did not justify wakefulness. Wakefulness was effort. Effort required reason. The presence of light did not qualify as a reason. The settlement treated light as background rather than invitation. Inside the houses, the difference between night and evening was minimal. Darkness arrived at roughly the same pace every day. Walls did not reflect the lingering glow. Shadows inside settled where they always had. Lamps were used when necessary and ignored when not. Summer did not change this calculation. The interior had learned how much light it needed and refused to ask for more. Children noticed the late darkness first. They were still moving when the sky should have been dimming. The light allowed them to remain visible slightly longer. It did not allow them to remain active longer. When told to stop, they stopped. The light did not argue. It watched quietly. Adults did not remark on the delay. There was nothing to remark on. The schedule had already been set by effort, expended rather than hours displayed. The sky had arrived late to a decision that had already been made. This created a calm mismatch between environment and behavior. The outside suggested continuation. The inside insisted on closure. Neither side attempted to dominate the other. The settlement did not hurry the night. The night did not hurry the settlement. They coexisted briefly without agreement. The long twilight did not inspire conversation. There was no gathering to observe it. Watching the sky would have required attention that no one had left. When work ended, rest began. The light outside became irrelevant background. There is a mild humor in imagining the sun waiting for acknowledgement. It stayed longer than necessary and received none. The settlement noticed the light only to the extent that it did not interfere. It did not interfere, and therefore required no response. Sleep arrived at the same time it always had. Not earlier, not later. The body closed itself when it needed to. The sky could remain visible without influencing that closure. The idea that light might delay sleep belonged to a different kind of place. Here, sleep was non-negotiable. Night sounds did not change much either. Insects filled the long evening with activity. Their movement was enthusiastic and persistent. This sound did not encourage wakefulness. It blended into the background the way other constants did. Noise did not demand participation. It existed without invitation. The forest looked different under extended light, but that difference was cosmetic. Paths remained the same. Obstacles remained where they had always been. No new routes appeared. The environment offered no new information that required processing. Seeing it longer did not mean understanding it better. The settlement accepted this without disappointment. Night arriving late did not feel like delay. It felt like redundancy. Darkness would arrive eventually, and nothing important would wait for it. The body had already moved on. Evening routines unfolded as usual. Tools were put away, spaces were closed, food was finished. None of this paused to accommodate the sky. Light did not receive ceremonial dismissal. It simply remained outside doing what it did best, which was being present without consequence. There was no sense of stretching the evening for enjoyment. Enjoyment required energy and attention. Both were already spent. The light outside could continue without witnesses. The settlement did not feel deprived by leaving it unused. Children slept without difficulty. Their bodies did not confuse light with permission. They had learned quickly that the sky did not set rules. Adults had learned that lesson long ago. The alignment across ages was effortless. The long evening created no memories. There was no specific night that stood out. Each evening blended into the next with slight variations in sound and temperature. The absence of difference prevented attachment. Without attachment, there was nothing to recall. This lack of distinction was calming. Nights did not compete for significance. They performed their function quietly. The settlement trusted them to do so regardless of schedule. Eventually, darkness arrived fully and without drama. It did not feel like relief. It felt like confirmation. The day had already ended. The sky was agreeing. In this way, summer nights passed without identity. They arrived later and changed nothing. Light did not translate into longer activity. Visibility did not become wakefulness. The sun offered time. Humans declined politely. There is something unsettling about this restraint. It suggests a refusal to be persuaded by conditions that promise more than they can deliver. The settlement did not chase the extra light. It allowed it to exist without altering behavior. Night remained night regardless of timing. Rest remained rest regardless of brightness. Summer did not stretch life. It illuminated its limits. And so the sky stayed bright while the settlement slept. The light outside outlasted attention. Inside, the rhythm remained intact. Night arrived late and found nothing to change. Sleep did not wait for darkness to complete its work. It arrived when the body reached a certain quiet threshold that light could not delay. Muscles softened, attention loosened. Thought lost its grip without ceremony. The sky could remain pale outside, and it would make no difference. Sleep followed fatigue, not clocks, and certainly not the sun. There was no ritual to prepare for it, no attempt to make the night feel special. Beds were used because they were there, not because the evening had been curated into something gentle. Rest was not earned through atmosphere. It was earned through effort spent. When that effort ran out, sleep stepped in without asking for permission. Summer nights were not romanticized here. They did not become occasions for reflection or softness. The shorter darkness did not inspire intimacy or longing. It inspired practicality. The body had worked. The body needed to stop. That was the entire logic. Anything else would have been decoration. Inside the houses, sleep arrived the same way every season. Breath slowed. Limbs found positions that reduced strain. The mind released its hold gradually, and then all at once, light leaking through small openings did not interrupt this process. The eyes closed because they were finished, not because the room was dark enough to impress them. There is a quiet irony in how much attention summer nights receive elsewhere. They are often described as gentle or inviting. Here they were simply incomplete. Darkness arrived later, but that delay did not add meaning. It reduced contrast. The night felt thinner but not different. The body noticed nothing worth adjusting for. Children fell asleep quickly. Their energy had been spent earlier and thoroughly. The extended evening had allowed movement to continue slightly longer, but it had also allowed fatigue to accumulate evenly. By the time rest came, there was nothing left to negotiate. Light outside did not confuse this. Sleep arrived cleanly and without resistance. Adults followed soon after. There was no effort to stay awake and appreciate the lingering glow. Appreciation required attention. Attention was gone. The idea of using the night for anything extra felt unnecessary. Tomorrow would require the same strength it always did. Preserving it mattered more than observing the sky. Older residents slept with even less ceremony. Their bodies recognized the signal early. When fatigue reached a certain density, there was no argument. Sleep did not ask to be persuaded. It simply arrived. The shorter night did not feel insufficient. It felt precise. Enough darkness existed to recover what had been spent. There is something faintly humorous in this calculation. The night was shorter, but still long enough to sleep through all the tiredness. Nothing was left over. No exhaustion waited unsatisfied for morning. The body used what it needed and ignored the rest. Dreams did not change with the season. If they appeared, they did so quietly. If they did not, no one missed them. Sleep was not expected to provide insight or comfort. It provided restoration. Summer did not modify that contract. Outside, the sky retained its pale presence for longer hours. Birds adjusted. Insects continued their noise with enthusiasm that bordered on arrogance. This sound did not romanticize the night. It did not lull or soothe. It existed. People slept through it because they always had. The forest held the remaining light without reaction. Leaves caught it briefly and then released it. Shadows behaved unpredictably, but no one watched them long enough to care. Inside the houses, sleep deepened regardless. There was no sense of borrowing time from the night. No one felt cheated by its brevity. Sleep was not measured in hours, but in recovery. If the body woke without heaviness, the night had been sufficient. Summer nights delivered that consistently. Morning arrived without consequence. Eyes opened when rest had completed its task. No one remarked that the night had been short. No one felt deprived. The body had recovered exactly as much as it needed to. Anything more would have been excess. This absence of complaint mattered. It showed that sleep had not been compromised. The night had been shorter in theory but complete in practice. Fatigue had been addressed fully. There was nothing left unfinished. The idea of a sleepless summer night belonged elsewhere. Here sleep was non-negotiable. It arrived because it was required and left when it had completed its work. Light outside did not interfere. Darkness did not need to deepen to invite it. There is a subtle calm in this arrangement that feels almost unsettling. It suggests a trust into the body that does not rely on environment. Sleep does not wait for the correct aesthetic. It waits for exhaustion. Summer nights provided enough darkness to satisfy that condition, and nothing more was asked of them. No one spoke about sleeping better or worse in summer. Sleep was not evaluated. It either happened or it did not. It happened, consistently. That consistency removed anxiety. The settlement did not attempt to improve sleep by adjusting behavior to the season. No later bedtimes, no earlier rising, no experiments. Habit had already solved the problem. Summer was not consulted. Even the shortness of the night became irrelevant over time. People stopped noticing when darkness arrived and when it left. They noticed only when they felt rested or not. Most days they felt rested enough. There is a mild irony in how often the season is credited with restfulness. Here rest was earned through work and protected through discipline. Summer offered a thinner night, and the settlement accepted it without drama. Sleep fit into the available space efficiently. As days repeated, this pattern reinforced itself. Fatigue arrived, sleep followed, light outside lingered. Inside, nothing changed. The night performed its function quietly, regardless of length. This quiet reliability removed any temptation to romanticize rest. Sleep was not a mood, it was a necessity. Summer nights did not dress it up. They simply accommodated it. When the season moved on and nights lengthened again, the adjustment was barely noticed. Sleep expanded naturally into the extra darkness. No one celebrated this either. It was just another condition handled smoothly. In this way, summer nights passed without identity. They were shorter and still sufficient. They arrived later and left earlier and fulfilled their purpose exactly. The body slept through all the tiredness it had accumulated and woke without resentment. The night did not need to be long to be enough. It only needed to be honest. Summer left without leaving a forwarding address. The end of summer did not announce itself. There was no moment that demanded recognition, no clear boundary where one condition stopped and another began. The light shortened gradually enough to avoid attention. One evening felt slightly dimmer than expected. Another morning arrived with less certainty. These changes were noticed only after they had already settled in. No one marked the transition because there was nothing to mark. The season did not collapse or withdraw dramatically. It simply loosened its hold and moved on. The settlement did not pause to acknowledge this. Pausing would have suggested that something important had shifted. Nothing had. Work continued without interruption. The tasks did not change in nature, only the materials responded differently. Wood felt cooler to the touch. Soil behaved with slightly more resistance. Air pressed less heavily against the body. These were adjustments rather than transformations. The work itself remained familiar. There is a quiet irony in how often seasons are described as turning points. Here the turn was so wide and slow that it never completed a full arc. It drifted. By the time anyone might have thought to notice it, the moment had already passed. Summer had left while everyone was busy continuing. No one said this is the last day of summer. That idea would have required a shared definition of what summer was supposed to feel like. The settlement had never agreed on such a thing. Summer had been a condition rather than an identity. When the condition changed slightly, behavior adjusted and nothing more was required. The light continued to arrive each morning. It simply arrived with less enthusiasm. The sun no longer lingered as if waiting to be acknowledged. It performed its function and moved on. Evenings arrived earlier, but not urgently. Darkness resumed its previous role without ceremony. There was no sense of loss. Nothing had been promised by the season that now needed mourning. Summer had not offered delight or ease. It had offered duration. When that duration ended, there was nothing emotional attached to it. The settlement accepted the change. The way it accepted all changes that did not interfere with routine. Work noticed first. Tools responded differently. Certain tasks required more effort. The body compensated quietly. Pace adjusted slightly. Rest arrived earlier. These shifts did not feel like consequences. They felt like calibration. The work remained. Only the resistance changed. This made the transition almost invisible. People remembered what they were doing rather than when the season changed. Memory attached itself to effort rather than atmosphere. If asked later when summer ended, no one could have answered with confidence. They could answer when a particular task required a different approach. That was the closest marker available. There is something unsettling about how easily the season erased itself. It passed through without leaving residue. No habits had been formed around it that now required undoing. No celebrations needed to be missed. No expectations needed to be lowered. Summer had never asked for that kind of investment. Even the insects withdrew gradually. Their noise softened before disappearing. No one remarked on their absence at first. Silence returned in layers. The forest adjusted its tone without announcement. The settlement accepted the quieter evenings without reflection. Children adapted without complaint. Their time outside shortened naturally as light faded earlier. There was no disappointment because there had been no agreement that summer belonged to them. Play adjusted to visibility and then retreated indoors. The change felt practical rather than emotional. Older residents noticed the shift only in the way the body responded. Joints felt different. Movement required slightly more preparation. This was not attributed to the season ending. It was attributed to conditions changing. The difference mattered only in how it affected the day. No one prepared for the end of summer because there was nothing to prepare for. Preparation implies anticipation. Anticipation requires narrative. The settlement did not narrate seasons. It navigated conditions. When the conditions shifted, navigation adjusted accordingly. There is a mild humor in how often calendars insist on precision. Here the season ignored dates completely. It behaved as if it had its own schedule that did not require agreement. It did not respect boundaries drawn on paper. It respected gradual change. The absence of a clear ending reduced anxiety. There was no final opportunity to miss. No last chance to do something before it was too late. Summer did not close a door. It simply stepped aside. Anything that had not been done remained possible under different conditions. Work that had continued through summer continued afterward. Only the texture of effort changed. Materials responded differently. The body responded differently. The tasks remained the same. This continuity softened the transition to the point of invisibility. There was no sense of entering a new phase. The year did not feel segmented. It felt continuous. One condition flowed into another without interruption. The settlement preferred this. Segments invited comparison. Comparison invited judgment. Continuity avoided both. Even language reflected this. No one said when summer ended. They said when something became harder to do, or when something required gloves again. The season was described indirectly through consequence rather than declaration. There is a quiet stability in this approach. Without a need to remember the end of summer, there was also no pressure to remember the summer itself. Memory was reserved for changes that mattered. Summer did not qualify. As days shortened further, the adjustment continued without complaint. Evening arrived earlier. Sleep followed, as it always had. The body recalibrated smoothly. The sky and the settlement remained out of sync without conflict. This lack of ceremony made the season easier to leave behind. Nothing needed closure, nothing needed explanation. Summer departed without leaving instructions or expectations. It did not ask to be missed. There is something faintly amusing about this efficiency. An entire season passed through the settlement without creating a single moment that demanded memory. It did its job and exited quietly. No forwarding address, no request for acknowledgement. When people later spoke of the year, they did not say during the summer. They said before this changed or after that stopped working. Time was measured by function rather than feeling. The season had no emotional footprint. In this way, summer completed itself perfectly. By never insisting on significance, it avoided disappointment. By never offering drama, it avoided nostalgia. It left the settlement exactly as it found it, with minor adjustments already absorbed. The end came without a line drawn across the calendar. It came as a gradual agreement between light and habit. When that agreement shifted, summer was already gone, and no one noticed the exact moment it left, because nothing had asked them to. A settlement that slept through the bright season. The settlement did not wake up for summer. It did not stretch toward it or adjust its posture to receive it. The season arrived with light and warmth and found a rhythm already in place. That rhythm did not speed up or slow down. It continued at the same pace it always had. Summer did not interrupt it. It simply passed through like a visitor who understood they were not the focus. Days moved forward with even weight. Morning did not feel lighter. Evening did not feel richer. The hours between them unfolded steadily, without asking for attention. People rose when they always had and rested when they needed to. The sky offered longer visibility and received polite indifference in return. Nothing important depended on how bright it was outside. Work did not become easier or harder in any meaningful way. It remained work. Materials responded slightly differently. Bodies adjusted quietly. The tasks themselves did not change their demands. Summer did not reward effort. It did not punish hesitation. It simply provided conditions and watched as those conditions were absorbed without drama. There is a faint irony in how much emphasis is often placed on seasons. Here the season was treated like background, useful but not inspiring, present but not persuasive. Summer did not elevate life. It did not diminish it. It existed and then it did not. That was enough. The settlement slept through the brightness, not in the sense of literal sleep, but in attention. It did not stay awake to notice the extra hours. It did not invest curiosity in the sky. Light extended itself and found no one waiting. Rest arrived on schedule. Fatigue remained the authority. The body did not negotiate with daylight. Children moved a little longer. Elders conserved a little more. Neither group treated this as an event. It was simply how energy behaved under different conditions. The season did not assign meaning to these changes. It allowed them and moved on. Meals appeared as they always had, sometimes more often, never with celebration. Eating remained functional. Hunger was addressed and dismissed. Summer did not teach the settlement to enjoy food more. It taught it to rely on the same food more often. That reliance felt normal rather than disappointing. Conversation did not shift into reflection. There was nothing to reflect on. No peak moments demanded memory. No hardship demanded explanation. The season offered continuity, and continuity does not produce stories. It produces stability. Stability rarely asks to be remembered. Even the end arrived without ceremony. The light shortened gradually. The air changed texture. Work adjusted. Sleep adjusted. No one announced that summer had finished. By the time it might have mattered, it was already gone. The settlement noticed only that conditions had changed and responded accordingly. There was no nostalgia. Nothing had been promised that now needed to be missed. Summer had not improved life enough to be praised. It had not challenged it enough to be blamed. It had performed its function quietly and left without requesting acknowledgement. This neutrality was not emptiness. It was balance. Life did not rise or fall with the season. It continued. That continuation was the point. Summer was never meant to be a chapter. It was meant to be a passage. There is something unsettling about how easily the season disappeared. It suggests that much of what we expect from time is imposed rather than inherent. Here time moved without trying to impress. The settlement allowed it to do so. When people later recalled the year, they did not separate it into bright months and dark ones. They remembered what had been finished and what remained. Summer did not earn a category of its own. It slipped between tasks without altering them. In this way, the settlement slept through the bright season with its eyes open, awake enough to work, rested enough to continue, unmoved by abundance of light, untroubled by its absence. Summer came and went, having done exactly what was required. Nothing more, nothing less. And that quiet completion was the most remarkable thing about it.